So we've seen how we can use different types of loops to essentially reduce redundancy in our code, right? So what I want us to do, I want us to get in the habit of combining everything that we have learned, right? So what we're going to do is essentially simulate ordering from a restaurant, right? So what we're going to do is pop up a message, and then that message we can order from that from the menu, and then accumulate the value until we are done ordering, and then just display the total, right? So let's just go ahead and create that code. All right, so let's just go ahead and create a functions file so that we can just separate our work. Then we can go ahead and also create a header file. Right, so we're just going to define our header file, right? If this is something that you're still not comfortable with, or you're just new to it, right, just go ahead and watch our, I think it is episode 7, right, where we discuss header files and compiling, right? Right, so what I want to do is create a namespace where we can just go and store our products, whatever we're selling, right? We're just going to store 3 products, right? So we're going to store a burger, price of a burger. I actually made a mistake, right? What we need to remember is that within header files, we do not assign any values, which is essentially just declare, right? What we're going to do is introduce a new keyword, right? The keyword is what we call extend, right? Extend essentially allows us to create variables, right, within a namespace in a header file, right? And then essentially what we're saying is that create this variable, right, but do not assign it, right? So that it exists somewhere, and then we're going to later on assign it, right? So let us just go ahead and create 3 more of these, right? Right, so and then we can just go ahead and declare this, or rather assign these variables, right? So we're just going to go in our function file and include the IOStream library, right? And then we're going to just include our header file so that we can have access to the declaration. Now we can essentially assign those values to our product, right? Now I actually want to introduce a new keyword when it comes to variables, right, which is the const keyword, right? So how the const keyword essentially works is that we the variable that is prefixed with the word const, right, can never be changed, right? So we know that essentially we already know that throughout the lifespan of this program, right, the value of the burger is not going to be changed. It's always going to be stay the same, right? So what we can do is essentially prefix our variables with the word constant. Right, so whenever we use constant, right, so what we want to do is essentially we want to capitalize our variables, right? This is not a must, it's just for us to be able to distinguish between normal variables and constant variables, right? So we can just go ahead and capitalize every variable here. Right, so now I'm just going to give those variables a value, right? Right, so once those variables are declared, right, then we have assigned them, we can go ahead and create the necessary functions, right? So the first function that we're going to create, right, is the display menu, right? So we're going to need to display the menu. Right. Remember, the reason why we're using our void in this case is because we're not returning anything. What we're going to do is essentially just display, right? So let's go ahead and implement the display menu, right? Right, so how we want to structure this code, right, what we want to do is essentially display the menu, right, for as long as the user does not exit the restaurant, right? So we're going to create 4 options, right? 3 of those options is the burger, the pizza, the pie, right? And the 4th option allows us to actually exit the restaurant, right? So what we're going to do is use a do while loop, because the do while is going to allow us to display the menu right before even any condition is checked, right? So what we're going to do is create a variable called option, right? And then we're going to write our do while statement, right? Do while. So what is the condition, right? So remember what we said. We said the first statement, rather the first option is going to be to order a burger. The second statement is going to be order a pizza. The third one is going to be to order a pie. And then the last one is where we actually exit, right? So while we're going to say, while the option is not equals to the 4th option, right? So remember, we're going to have a bunch of options that we're going to show, right? So I'm just going to show you how that works, right? So we're saying, remember how this not operator works, right? So we're saying while it is not equals to 4, right, this loop can continue going, right? So we can continue essentially displaying the menu and allowing the user to continue ordering, right? So now let's just go ahead and actually display that menu, right? Right, so let us just go through what we have done, right? So we've created a variable, which is the option, right? We haven't assigned any value to it, right? So we have used the do while, right, to display this before any condition is checked, right? So essentially, when they walk into our fast food store, this is what they're going to see, right? So we have displayed a message that just says welcome to our fast food store, right? And then this is the menu, right? It's either burger, pizza, or pie, right? Or you can exit, right? So and then whatever value they enter, we're going to read the value, right, into our variable option, right? And then we're going to do something, right? But before we do that something, we know that this condition is always going to be checked after a set of statements to see that the value that was entered was not 4, right? So before we can do that, right, so suppose the value that was entered is 1, 2, 3, or just some random value, right, but not 4, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use a switch, right, so that we can essentially, for each value that was entered, we can have a specific calculation, right? So if it was burger that was entered, we can increase the value, the total value by burger, right? So let's just go ahead and do that, right? We're going to create a switch, right? So remember, in this case, we are allowed to use switches because of the data type that we want to compare, right? A switch can only compare integer, boolean, or char, right? So we can go ahead and compare the option. Right, so for case 1, we're going to have a scenario in which the case 1 is going to represent burger, right? So we know that when option 1 is pressed, right, we're going to represent burger. So what we want to do is increase our total by the price of the burger, right? So let's just go ahead and create the total, right? That's something I forgot to do. Right, what we need to note is that in this case, we cannot have the const keyword in front of the total value, because this is the value that's going to constantly be updated, right? It's constantly going to be updated, so it's not something that we want to keep constant throughout the lifespan of this program, right? So we can go ahead and create the variable total. And give it the value 0, right? Starting off with 0, right? So what we're going to do is, if it is case 1, we're going to access the total price within the namespace products, right? And then update the value, right, by the value of the burger, right? So we're just going to access the burger, right? Right, that's essentially what we want to do. And then don't forget to use a break, right? A break statement, right? And then we're just going to copy this out for the rest of the cases. Right, so what we need to remember is to update these values. For 2, it's going to represent pizza. And then for 3, it's going to represent pie. So by default, if the person did not enter options between 1 and 4, right, what we want to display is that they've entered invalid input, right? So we're just going to go ahead and display that. Right, and then for case 4, what I want to do is essentially just simulate us exiting the app, right? So what I'm going to do is just output. Right, so the first 3 cases are just going to update the value of the total, right? And then the last rather case 4, right, what it's going to do is essentially it's going to be exiting our program, right? And then for the default case, which is anything that's entered beyond our range, which is 1 to 4, is essentially going to be invalid input, right? So what we can see is that if case 4 is met, right, which is the case 4 of exiting, we're going to be exiting this loop, right? So essentially this condition is no longer going to be met because 4 is going to be equals to 4, right? So the loop is no longer going to run, right? So what we want to do is essentially just go ahead and display the following, right? We're going to display the total. Your total is, then we're going to access the total in the product. Right, so that's essentially how our code is going to operate, right? So we can see how we have used our loops, we can use our conditions, we've used our namespaces, our variables, our functions. So everything is just starting to come together. Like, let's just go ahead and call that in our main function. All right, so let's just go ahead and compile that. So a shorter notation, whenever you have multiple files, what you can do is go ahead and use a star, right, and say follow it up by .cpp, right? This is essentially just going to compile every file, right, that had in your folder that is the .cpp, right? So you can just go ahead and do that. Right, once that compiles, we can go ahead and run our code. Right, so we see that we are prompted with a message that says welcome to our fast food store, right? So let's just test out the different types of input that we may have, right? So suppose we press 5, right? Let us see what is going to be outputted, right? So we can see that it's going to say invalid input and prompt us to enter this again, right? So let's go ahead and press option 1, which is burger, right? And then we are prompted with the message again, right? So only after we press 4, right, is when the program is essentially going to end, right? And then it's going to essentially print our total, right? So let's go ahead and do that. And we can see that our total is 10.99, right? And then the message that just says thank you. Let me just go ahead and put space on that. So let's just go ahead and recompile that. Right, so let's just go ahead and order one of each. Right, let's just go ahead and order the burger, and then secondly order the pizza, and thirdly order the pie. Right, once we are done with that, we're just going to exit. Right, we can see that this is our total. Right, this is our total for everything that we have ordered. Right, let's just go ahead and confirm that. Right, so the value of this is going to be 17. 13. I don't know how these decimals end up working, but I believe that that is the value of that we're going to get. Right, just go ahead and check that on my calculator. Right, yeah, that is indeed the value, 22.97, right? So our program is working as intended, right? So we can see how we can start bringing up everything together, right? And I think that's a habit that we need to get it's a habit that we need to get used to, right? Just whatever we've learned, just bring it together to just sort of build something that is I guess, simulate the real world, right? So we've come to the end of our episode. If you really enjoyed this episode, you can go ahead and leave a like. If you don't want to miss any releases, you can go ahead and subscribe. Otherwise, cheers.